Hi guys, greetings from Iceland. Looks just like my house, doesn't it? Just kidding. This is our pre-recorded mini lesson on apartheid. So we're going to look at the kind of basic rollout and end of the apartheid government in South Africa today. And in class, you'll be watching a documentary called Amandla, which means power to the people, looking at all the imagery, all the footage, and the premise of the documentary is tracing the resistance movement via song. So there'll be kind of assignment along with that, and you'll just get to look at it more in depth. So if you're missing that, sorry, but the rest of you will get a nice look. So we're looking at South Africa because unlike the other countries that we'll look at in their independence movement, South Africa is on a totally different timeline and it's on its own course because of the white presence in that region for a long period of time. So as we know, the Dutch and the English have had a presence in that area. They have not gotten along very well. There have been two wars between those groups at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, but essentially leading to South Africa gaining autonomy before the other regions of Africa early on. Africa doesn't have a specific independence movement. In 1910, it gains autonomy under the dominion of the English Empire, and then by 1960, it's a republic given more independence, but only for the whites. And in 1990, non-white South Africans gain more power. But we need to look at the establishment of the apartheid government today and the end of it. Some of you might already know a little bit about apartheid via this movie that used to be on the Disney Channel. Maybe it's come up in reruns, but it is the story of a Black American family and they get an exchange student from Africa and she ends up being white. And it's this whole misunderstanding, but it is all in the apartheid era. And in the end, everybody learns lessons about racism and being nice to people. If you're not sure about it, I'm sure you can Google it, or I feel like Kate Cleary would know about this movie. Maybe Ledbetter would too. So in the year 1948, the Nationalist Party wins the election of South Africa and begins to enact the policy of apartheid. Apartheid in Afrikaans means separateness. And to the Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd, seen here on the far right of the screen, he described this not as a policy of racism or oppression, but as a policy of good neighborliness. And what this means is he wanted a separate state for the whites and what he called the non-whites, which is a very strategic choice of words. And in these separate spheres, the whites would retain the power and the non-whites would have their own separate places to live, etc. But of course, this will lead to an extremely unbalanced separation of services and goods and land. All the policies that helped the white South Africans consolidate power were not rolled out overnight, but over the course of really over a decade, but ultimately did help the whites gain full power. And as you can see in this chart that looks at the distribution of goods and services and land in the year 1978, we can see that the apartheid government did succeed in consolidating most power and privilege for the whites. For example, if you look at the population, there are over 19 million Black South Africans and only 4.5 million whites. And we compare that to the land distribution, we see that of those 19 million Black South Africans, they're only living on 13% of the land. And we'll see that land was not particularly good land, whereas the minority of white South Africans are living on 87% of the far better land. One of the best ways to show the well-being of a people is to definitely look at doctors to population ratio to get a sense of healthcare. And here you can see there was one doctor for every 44,000 Black South Africans, whereas there's one for every 400 white South Africans. So that's crazy. And then that further plays out in the infant mortality rates. So children living past the age of 1. So for Black South Africans, we're looking at 20% of children are dying before the age of 1 in urban Black South African populations, and 40% of Black South Africans living in rural areas are dying before the age of 1, usually of completely unnecessary diseases, like diarrhea, very treatable things. And of course, education is key. And it's best to have a small group of students, a ratio where teachers can actually give individual attention to students. So for Black South Africans, there was one teacher for every 60 students. I cannot imagine doubling the size of my period 9 class. Whereas the white South Africans enjoyed a better ratio of one teacher for every 22 students, which is absolutely ideal, right? So by the 70s, everything's far unequal, and this is definitely worse than Jim Crow and the separate but equal policies in the United States. Both are brutal, but here we're looking at a majority of people who have absolutely no access to rights and to services. And so this is taking our own American history with discrimination and segregation and amplifying it. So some examples of the apartheid legislation that gave the whites such privilege in South Africa include the passage of the Homeland Act, in which Black South Africans were moved to what were called homelands, also known as Bantustans, which were sections of South Africa reserved, right, for Blacks, very similar to the reservations for Native Americans, and also similar in that they weren't particularly fertile or convenient places to live. So people were forcibly moved from their homes to these lands. It also should be noted that if you were mixed race or in any way have any Black blood in you or any kind of non-white blood, as they called it, you were grouped into this. So you're forcibly moved to the colored areas seen on the map here. And definitely these were, not places that were nice to live. As you'll see in the video, they kind of compare it to train cars. They're just all lined up, very packed houses, very bad living conditions, as you can see in a couple of these pictures. Also included in apartheid legislation were laws such as no mixed race marriage, no non-white demonstration or political gathering, and obviously no non-white voting privileges whatsoever. And then one of the more controversial laws that's passed in the 50s were the pass laws, in which non-white South Africans were required to carry a passbook with them, which showed their ethnicity and showed where they were allowed to be in their own country. So their citizenship in terms of the Bantustan they were supposed to live in. And if you were working somewhere else, maybe you're working in Cape Town and Johannesburg, maybe you're working in a mine that wasn't part of another Bantustan, you had to have express permission. And if you were found living or passing through a place that you did not have permission in, you could be jailed for a long period of time. And all of these laws, but especially the pass laws, leads to all these resistance movements over time. A lot of gathering, a lot of protests and marches, and also the formation of anti-apartheid political groups such as the African National Congress and some other groups that we will discuss. The African National Congress was founded in 1912, and these are some of the founding members. And similar to other early political parties we see in colonial or subjected regions, the intention of these parties were not to claim independence or to overthrow these Western powers, but to have more representation. But as the pass laws and other apartheid legislations became worse, we see them play a more active role. This especially starts when Nelson Mandela founds the ANC Youth League in 1948 and begins to promote using more violence than the traditionally nonviolent ANC main wing. And this is important to note because Mandela has such an interesting perception in being this symbol of nonviolence. He's so incredible, but he actually has a very complicated past. The ANC did promote using violence because the apartheid government was becoming more violent towards them, as we can see in the Sharpeville massacre, which Nelson Mandela orchestrated to protest the pass laws. This is a huge demonstration of nonviolent protesters that were met with extreme violence, and many were killed, many of them shot in the back as they were fleeing the apartheid police and army. So in the face of these types of things, they begin to promote more violence over time. Eventually, in the 70s, another group emerges from the ANC, the Mkhonto-Wesizwe, which is known as the Spear of the Nation and also abbreviated as the MK. This organization militarized, often went to other African nations to learn fighting techniques and did get weapons from all over the place, but notably the Soviet Union, in order to actually engage the apartheid armies that were unleashing tanks against protesters. As in the 70s and 80s, violence got increasingly worse between these groups as the protests emerged. And on the back end of this, Mandela did engage with the Soviet Union. He did ally with Fidel Castro and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya because he saw them as other people fighting against imperialism and Western dominance and all these things that were evils in South Africa, according to his perception. So he's kind of a mixed bag, but is ultimately this symbol, right, for the apartheid movement, and is one of the examples of apartheid resistance happening for the Black and mixed race South Africans. Another main anti-apartheid group that emerges is the South African Student Organization that was key in mobilizing the youth of South Africa. This becomes big in the 70s under leader Steve Biko, whose book I have here. This is my own personal copy with all my notes from college. Steve was a medical student who eventually becomes the voice of the Black consciousness movement. And this really begins in his series of essays that are eventually put together in this I Write What I Like series, which I just love that title. So he gives a different perspective to the movement. So for Steve Biko and the Black consciousness movement, he thought the very first thing that the Black South Africans had to do is stand up for themselves and to abandon the terminology that the white South African government had pushed onto them. So he's one of the first South African protesters to use the term Black, right, to assume a full identity and not to be called non-white, not to be defined by what they weren't. So that becomes a big part of his movement, of his identity. And he thought that the first step was to convince South Africans that they were worth independence, to remind them of their own humanity. Because he very famously says in his essay, White Racism and Black Consciousness, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And he essentially believes that the Black man has become dehumanized in the process of apartheid. And he very famously says in the essay, We Blacks, the logic behind white domination is to prepare the Black man for the subservient role in this country. Not so long ago, this used to be freely said in Parliament, even about the educational system of Black people. It is still said even today, although in a much more sophisticated language. To a large extent, the evildoers have succeeded in producing at the output of their machine a kind of Black man who is only man in form. This is the extent to which the process of dehumanization has advanced. Right? So first he pushes people to assume a certain vocabulary, and then he pushes them to reject the institutions that have demoralized and dehumanized them. And a big part of this is the educational system. In the 70s, the apartheid government passed a law that would have enforced that all schools use the Afrikaans language in the schools rather than the local language that they were using, which could have been English, it could have been Zulu, it could have been Xhosa, a variety of language. But now they'd have to learn in the language of their oppressor, a language many students didn't know very well, so it would have just screwed their education even more. And this leads to the Soweto student protests, which were a series of young persons' protests that were extremely bloody, a lot of young students dying. And as this is happening in the 70s, the world is watching, and finally it's getting enough attention that we start to see pressure from abroad put on the apartheid government to reduce its policies and to eventually transition out of apartheid. So by the late 70s, early 80s, the apartheid government had severely cracked down on the anti-apartheid movement. In the early 60s, so by 1963, Nelson Mandela had been jailed what they believed would have been for life on Robben Island, so the ANC loses one of its key figures, and many others were either exiled, put on house arrest, or fully jailed. and Steve Biko in 1977 after one of his various imprisonments was found dead in his jail cell with what the authorities said was an accident, but was very much apparent that he was beaten to death. Right, so many key leaders are killed, and the government is cracking down on these various forms of protest, and the protesters themselves are becoming extremely violent. So things are coming to a head. We see movements from abroad try to put pressure on the apartheid government to come to an end. So various groups, everyone from universities like Harvard, local governments, the American government, all begin to wage sanctions against South Africa. They are banned from the Olympics. And eventually we see F.W. de Klerk begins to slowly unravel the apartheid government. Starting in 1988, F.W. de Klerk begins to unravel apartheid government by first lifting the ban on all anti-apartheid political groups. And then starting in 1990, he begins to release the political prisoners. So notably in 1990, Nelson Mandela is freed from prison. And I remember watching that on TV when I was little. So I was like 8. I didn't really know what was going on, but I just felt like it was really important. And I remember crying a lot. That was just a kind of like ignorant young American girl kind of feeling the importance of this moment. So you can imagine what the South Africans felt. So this is monumental. And then they begin to set into place the election that would take place in 1994, which would be the first time all members of South African society could vote in an election. This is what the ballot looked like. So we can see that there are so many people running for the election, even though everyone expected that Nelson Mandela and the ANC would win the presidency. But everyone ran because they could. And you also note how many images need to be on the ballot because of the levels of illiteracy that were left behind because of the legacy of apartheid. So that's notable. And also notable are the lines people waited in. People waited forever to vote. Now in American elections, people won't wait like 5 minutes to vote, but it's reported that people waited nearly up to a day to vote in this election. It was so historic. And Nelson Mandela did win the presidency. But the issue after was to deal with the wounds of apartheid because, such atrocities had happened. And we get a very notable example of recovery here in the setup of what were called the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. This was orchestrated mostly by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, seen here, he's adorable. And the idea of this was to bring out into open all the terrible atrocities of apartheid, to allow certain amounts of amnesty, realizing that some people became victims of apartheid, even those people that had committed violence. And so to put in front of each other, a victim and a perpetrator, right? So a Black South African and a member of the, Afrikaner army, right, who might have hurt them or maybe a family member, and make them kind of deal with their issues abroad. And to promote rehabilitation, to promote reconciliation, to prevent any future violence from occurring. And this was proven to be largely successful, although there were moments of violence that spurred afterwards. But this is something that will be copied in the future. It becomes a process known as restorative justice. All right, so there you have it. There is your basic background on the apartheid government and its fall. And in class, you'll be watching Amandla, the documentary looking at the resistance movements with a ton of great footage, and I hope that you get a lot out of it.